The memory care facility smelled of lavender and disinfectant, a combination that somehow managed to feel both sterile and homey at the same time. Soft classical music drifted through the corridors while afternoon sunlight streamed through tall windows, casting gentle shadows across polished floors. In room 237, an elderly man sat motionless in his wheelchair, staring out at the garden where other residents shuffled along paved walkways with their caregivers. His name was Theodore Blackwood, though most days he couldn't remember it. What he could remember came in fragments, like pieces of a puzzle scattered by an invisible hand. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Theodore's son Marcus visited every Sunday without fail, arriving in his black Tesla at precisely 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Marcus Blackwood had built an empire from nothing, transforming a small software startup into a global technology conglomerate worth billions. His tailored suits cost more than most people's cars, and his time was measured in millions of dollars per hour. Yet every Sunday, he sat in that beige visitor's chair beside his father's bed, speaking softly about things Theodore would never remember. Today was different, though neither man knew it yet. The regular caregiver, Mrs. Patterson, had called in sick that morning with the flu. The staffing agency had sent a replacement, a woman in her early 30s with auburn hair pulled back in a simple ponytail and kind eyes that seemed to hold secrets. Her name was Sarah Chen, and she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had learned to find strength in difficult places. Sarah knocked gently on the doorframe before entering room 237. Theodore didn't turn his head, didn't acknowledge her presence in any way. She had read his file during her brief orientation that morning. Alzheimer's disease, advanced stage. Minimal verbal communication. Occasional episodes of agitation. Son visits weekly. No other family listed. She approached slowly, her soft-soled shoes making barely a whisper against the linoleum floor. Theodore's medical chart described a man who had retreated so far into the fog of his deteriorating mind that meaningful connection seemed impossible. The staff had warned her that he rarely spoke, rarely made eye contact, and showed little response to external stimuli. But when Sarah stepped into his line of sight and gently touched his shoulder, something extraordinary happened. Theodore's cloudy blue eyes suddenly focused with startling clarity. His weathered hand, which hadn't moved purposefully in months, lifted slowly toward her face. His lips, which the nurses said barely formed words anymore, parted with visible effort. "I remember you from somewhere," he whispered, his voice rough with disuse but unmistakably present. The words hung in the air like a revelation, impossible yet undeniable. Sarah felt her breath catch. In her 3 years of working with Alzheimer's patients, she had witnessed many moments of unexpected lucidity, brief windows when the clouds parted and the person inside emerged. But this felt different. This felt like recognition that ran deeper than memory, like something cellular and profound. She knelt beside his wheelchair, bringing herself to his eye level. Theodore's gaze didn't waver, didn't slip back into the vacant stare that had become his default expression. Instead, his eyes searched her face with an intensity that made her heart race. "You have her eyes," he continued, his voice gaining strength with each word. "Margaret's eyes. Same green, same little flecks of gold around the edges." Sarah's world tilted. Margaret had been her mother's name, the mother she had lost when she was 7 years old. The mother whose face she could barely remember, whose voice had faded from her memory like smoke. She had been told that Margaret Chen had died in a car accident, leaving behind a young daughter who would spend the next decade bouncing between foster homes before aging out of the system at 18. "I don't understand," Sarah whispered, though part of her was beginning to suspect that she might. Theodore's hand found hers with surprising steadiness. His skin was paper-thin and spotted with age, but his grip was firm, urgent. "Margaret Blackwood," he said with absolute certainty. "My daughter. My beautiful daughter who disappeared 25 years ago." The room seemed to spin around Sarah as the implications of his words crashed over her like a wave. She thought of the mother she barely remembered, the woman whose maiden name had been listed as Chen on the few official documents Sarah possessed. She thought of the father she had never known, whose identity had been listed as unknown on her birth certificate. She thought of the years she had spent wondering about her origins, about the family she had never known she might have. "That's not possible," she managed to say, though her voice sounded hollow even to her own ears. My mother's name was Margaret Chen. She was never married. I was told my father wasn't in the picture. Theodore's eyes filled with tears, but they were the kind of tears that come with recognition, not confusion. She changed her name after she left, he said softly. Took her mother's maiden name. We had a fight, a terrible fight. She was 19, stubborn, proud, just like her mother. She stormed out one night and never came back. Sarah felt the floor beneath her feet seem to shift and buckle. Everything she had believed about her life, about her family, about her place in the world, was suddenly called into question. She looked at this frail old man who claimed to be her grandfather, this stranger whose son was one of the most powerful men in the country, and tried to reconcile it with the lonely childhood she remembered, the years of wondering where she belonged. "I have a brother?" she asked, the words feeling strange and impossible on her tongue. "Marcus," Theodore said, and his voice carried a weight of love and regret that made Sarah's chest tighten. He was 2 when Margaret left. He doesn't remember her, doesn't remember having a sister. I never told him. I thought she would come back. I thought she would forgive me for the things I said. The afternoon light slanted through the window, casting long shadows across the room as Sarah struggled to process what she was hearing. Part of her wanted to dismiss it as the confused ramblings of a diseased mind. Alzheimer's patients often created elaborate stories, mixing fragments of memory with imagination to fill the gaps in their recollections. But the details Theodore provided, the specificity of his memories about her mother, the way his eyes had focused when he saw her, all of it felt too real to be dismissed. "What did you fight about?" she asked quietly. Theodore's expression grew distant, painful. Her mother had died the year before. Cancer. Margaret wanted to leave school, leave everything, and travel. She said she needed to find herself, to see the world before she got trapped in the life I had planned for her. I was building my first company then, working 18-hour days, trying to establish something that would last. I told her she was being foolish, that education and stability mattered more than chasing dreams. He paused. His breathing labored with the effort of remembering and speaking. She said I didn't understand her, didn't see her as anything more than an extension of my ambitions. She said I was so focused on building a legacy that I had forgotten about building a family. We both said things we couldn't take back. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes as she imagined her young mother, pregnant and alone, making the difficult decision to disappear rather than return home. She thought of the struggles Margaret must have faced, raising a child by herself with no family support, no safety net. She thought of the accident that had taken her mother's life when Sarah was 7, leaving her completely alone in the world. "She died when I was 7, Sarah said softly. "Car accident. I went into foster care after that." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The pain that crossed Theodore's face was immediate and profound. He closed his eyes as if the weight of this knowledge was too much to bear. "I hired private investigators," he whispered. "For years I looked for her. But she had covered her tracks well, changed her name, moved across the country. I never stopped hoping she would call, that she would let me apologize." The door to room 237 opened with a soft click, and Marcus Blackwood stepped inside with his usual precise punctuality. He was a tall man in his late 20s, with dark hair and sharp features that spoke of intelligence and determination. His expensive suit was perfectly tailored, his leather shoes polished to mirror brightness. He carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any room he entered. But when he saw his father engaged in animated conversation with a stranger, speaking more clearly than he had in months, Marcus stopped short. He had grown accustomed to his father's silence, to the vacant stare that had replaced the sharp intellect he remembered from childhood. To see Theodore not only alert but actively communicating was startling enough. To see tears streaming down his weathered cheeks was unprecedented. "Dad?" Marcus said uncertainly, setting down the small bouquet of flowers he brought every week. "Is everything all right?" Theodore turned toward his son with an expression more lucid than Marcus had seen in years. "Marcus," he said with perfect clarity, "I want you to meet someone very important." Sarah felt her heart hammering against her ribs as she stood to face the man who might be her brother. Marcus was handsome in the way that money and good genetics could make a person handsome, but there was something guarded in his expression, something that spoke of a man who had learned not to trust easily. His eyes, she noticed with a start, were the same shade of blue as Theodore's, the same shade she remembered seeing in faded photographs of her mother. "This is Sarah," Theodore continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "Your sister." The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus looked from his father to Sarah and back again, his expression cycling through confusion, disbelief, and something that might have been hope before settling into professional skepticism. "Dad," he said carefully, the way one might speak to a confused child, "you know that's not possible. I don't have a sister." "You do," Theodore insisted with startling firmness. "Margaret's daughter. My granddaughter." Marcus ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair, a gesture that somehow made him look younger and more vulnerable. Sarah could see him struggling to process what he was hearing, to reconcile his father's apparent clarity with the impossibility of what he was claiming. "Margaret was your daughter?" Sarah asked quietly, needing to hear it again, to have it confirmed. "My firstborn," Theodore said with unmistakable pride and regret. "Beautiful, brilliant, stubborn as hell. She left when you were just a baby. I never got to meet you, never got to be your grandfather." Sarah felt the room spinning around her as the full impact of this revelation hit her. If what Theodore was saying was true, then the man standing across from her wasn't just any billionaire businessman. He was her brother. The family she had dreamed of finding as a lonely child in foster care wasn't just real, but was sitting right in front of her. Marcus, however, was clearly struggling with his own disbelief. "This is the disease talking," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Dad, you know how your memory gets confused sometimes. You create stories that feel real but aren't actually based on facts." But even as he spoke, Marcus found himself studying Sarah's face with growing fascination. There was something familiar about her features, something that tugged at memories he wasn't even sure he possessed. The shape of her eyes, the line of her jaw, the way she tilted her head when she was thinking, all of it felt like looking into a mirror that reflected not his own image, but something deeper, something genetic and undeniable. Theodore's voice cut through the tension in the room with startling authority. "Get the box," he said to Marcus, his tone brooking no argument despite his frail appearance. "What box?" "From my closet at the house. The one I told you never to open. It's time." Marcus had indeed seen that box countless times over the years, tucked away on the highest shelf in his father's walk-in closet. It was an old wooden jewelry box with intricate carvings, the kind of thing that might hold precious memories or important documents. Theodore had always been secretive about its contents, deflecting questions with vague responses or changing the subject entirely. "Dad, I don't think." "Get the box, Marcus." Theodore's voice carried an edge of the commanding presence he had once wielded in boardrooms and business meetings. Even diminished by disease, there was no mistaking the authority in his tone. The tension in the room was palpable as Marcus weighed his options. Part of him wanted to dismiss this entire conversation as the product of his father's deteriorating mind. It would be easier that way, safer. His life was carefully ordered, precisely controlled. The idea of a sister, of a family history he knew nothing about, threatened to upend everything he thought he understood about himself and his place in the world. But another part of him, the part that remembered being a lonely child in a house too large and too quiet, wondered what it might mean to discover he hadn't been as alone as he had always believed. Sarah watched this internal struggle play out across Marcus's features and felt a surge of empathy for him. She understood the fear of hoping for something that might not be real. She had spent years learning not to fantasize about the family she might have had, the different life that might have been possible if circumstances had been different. "I should probably go," she said softly, not wanting to intrude on what was clearly a family moment, even if she might somehow be part of that family. "No," Theodore said firmly, his hand reaching out to grasp hers again. "Stay, please. I've lost 25 years with you already. I don't want to lose another moment." Marcus looked at the way his father held Sarah's hand, at the clarity in Theodore's eyes that he hadn't seen in months, at the obvious comfort Theodore took in her presence. Whatever was happening here, whatever the truth might be, it was having a positive effect on his father's condition. That alone was worth investigating. "I'll get the box," he said finally, his voice quiet but decisive. The drive to the Blackwood estate took Marcus through tree-lined streets where mansions sat behind iron gates and carefully manicured lawns. He had made this drive thousands of times over the years, but today it felt different. Today he was returning home to retrieve evidence of a past he had never known existed, of a family history that had been hidden from him for his entire life. The house was a sprawling, Tudor-style mansion that had been his childhood home, the place where he had learned to walk and talk and eventually to carry the weight of the Blackwood name. It was filled with expensive furniture and priceless art, but it had never felt particularly warm or welcoming. Now, as he climbed the familiar staircase to his father's room, Marcus found himself wondering what other secrets these walls might hold. The box was exactly where it had always been, tucked away on the highest shelf of Theodore's closet, behind a row of rarely worn formal wear. It was heavier than Marcus had expected, solid wood with brass hinges that had tarnished with age. The intricate carvings on its surface depicted intertwining roses and vines, the kind of craftsmanship that spoke of care and intention. Marcus set the box on his father's bed and stared at it for a long moment before lifting the lid. Inside, wrapped in yellowed tissue paper, were photographs, dozens of them, chronicling what appeared to be a life he had never known his father had lived. The first photograph showed a much younger Theodore, standing beside a beautiful woman with dark hair and green eyes. She was wearing a wedding dress, simple but elegant, and both of them looked radiantly happy. The woman's resemblance to Sarah was unmistakable. The same eyes, the same smile, the same delicate bone structure. Marcus's hands shook slightly as he lifted the photograph and saw the inscription on the back: Theodore and Elizabeth Blackwood, September 12, 1970. His mother. The woman who had died when he was too young to remember her clearly, whose memory had been preserved only in the few formal portraits that hung in the downstairs hallway. But as he continued through the photographs, he realized this wasn't just documentation of his parents' marriage. These were family photos, candid shots that captured moments of genuine happiness and intimacy. There was Theodore pushing a young girl on a swing set that Marcus didn't remember. Elizabeth holding a toddler who looked unmistakably like a younger version of Marcus himself. And in several of the later photographs, a baby girl with the same green eyes as her mother. One photograph in particular made Marcus's breath catch. It showed the entire family together on what appeared to be Christmas morning. Theodore and Elizabeth sat on a couch with two children, a toddler who was clearly Marcus himself, and an older girl who couldn't have been more than 3 or 4 years old. The girl had Sarah's eyes, Sarah's nose, Sarah's smile. She was holding a stuffed elephant and grinning at the camera with pure, uncomplicated joy. At the bottom of the box, beneath layers of photographs and baby clothes that had been carefully preserved, Marcus found official documents. A birth certificate for Margaret Elizabeth Blackwood, born February 14, 1975. Hospital records from her birth. Report cards from elementary school showing a bright, curious child who excelled in art and reading. And then, near the very bottom, a letter. The paper was cream-colored and expensive, the kind Theodore had always used for important correspondence. The handwriting was unmistakably his father's, though the ink had faded with time. "My dearest Margaret," it began, "I know you will probably never read this letter, but I had to write it anyway. I had to put these words somewhere, even if they never reach you." Marcus read the letter with growing amazement and sorrow. It was dated just 6 months after Margaret had left, and it was filled with regret, apology, and desperate love. Theodore wrote about the mistakes he had made, the words he wished he could take back, the way he had prioritized his work over his family. He wrote about missing her, about wondering if she was safe and happy, about hoping that someday she might forgive him enough to come home. "I understand now why you left," the letter continued. "I understand that I failed you as a father, that I made you feel like your dreams and desires didn't matter. I was so focused on providing for our family financially that I forgot to actually be present for you emotionally. I hope that wherever you are, you're finding the adventure and freedom you were looking for. I hope you're happy." The letter went on for several pages, growing more emotional and raw with each paragraph. Theodore wrote about Marcus, about how the little boy asked for his sister constantly in the months after she left, about how difficult it was to explain that she wasn't coming back without being able to explain why. "I've decided not to tell Marcus about you until he's older," Theodore had written. "I keep hoping you'll come home before then, that we'll be able to explain together what happened and why. But if you never do come back, I want him to know that he had a sister who loved him, who used to sing him to sleep and read him stories and make him laugh when he was scared." The final paragraph of the letter made Marcus's eyes burn with unshed tears. "I love you, Margaret. I will always love you. And I will spend every day for the rest of my life hoping that someday I'll get the chance to tell you that in person. If you ever change your mind, if you ever want to come home, there will always be a place for you here. You are my daughter, my firstborn, my pride and joy. Nothing you could do or say would ever change that." Marcus carefully folded the letter and placed it back in the box with trembling hands. The drive back to the memory care facility passed in a blur of overwhelming emotion and racing thoughts. Everything he thought he knew about his childhood, about his family, about himself, had been turned upside down in the span of a single afternoon. When he returned to room 237, he found Sarah and Theodore exactly where he had left them. She was sitting beside his wheelchair now, holding his hand while he told her stories about her mother. Both of them looked up when Marcus entered, and he could see the anticipation and anxiety in their faces. Without saying a word, Marcus set the wooden box on Theodore's bedside table and opened it. He withdrew the Christmas photograph, the one that showed all four of them together as a family, and handed it to Sarah. Sarah's intake of breath was audible in the quiet room. She stared at the photograph with wonder and recognition, her fingers tracing the edges of the image, as if she could somehow touch the moment it captured. "That's her," she whispered. "That's my mother." "That's Margaret," Theodore confirmed, his voice thick with emotion. "And that little boy is Marcus." Sarah looked up at Marcus with tears streaming down her face. "We were a family," she said, as if she couldn't quite believe it. Marcus nodded, his own composure finally cracking. "We were," he said, his voice rough with emotion he had spent years learning to suppress. "I'm sorry I didn't believe you. I'm sorry it took so long to find you." The afternoon sun was setting outside the windows of the memory care facility, casting long shadows across the room where three people sat surrounded by the pieces of a puzzle that had finally been put back together. Theodore held Sarah's hand on one side and Marcus's on the other, creating a connection that spanned decades and bridged the gaps that loss and misunderstanding had created. "Tell me about her," Sarah said softly. "Tell me about my mother." And Theodore began to speak, his voice stronger and clearer than it had been in months, as if the act of sharing these long-buried memories was somehow healing the broken pathways in his mind. He told them about Margaret's laugh, which could light up an entire room. He told them about her love of art and music, how she would spend hours drawing pictures of imaginary worlds and singing songs she made up herself. She was fierce, Theodore said with obvious pride. Never backed down from anything, never let anyone tell her she couldn't do something just because she was a girl. She wanted to travel the world, to see everything and experience everything. I thought that was foolish at the time. I thought security and stability were more important than adventure. Marcus listened to these stories with fascination and growing sadness. He had grown up without knowing he had a sister, without understanding that there had once been laughter and music and creativity in the house that had always felt so formal and quiet to him. "What was she like with me?" he asked hesitantly. Theodore's eyes brightened with the memory. "She adored you," he said without hesitation. "You followed her everywhere, wanted to do everything she did. She would read to you for hours, make up stories about brave knights and magical kingdoms. When you had nightmares, she was the one who could calm you down. She had this way of making you feel safe and loved and important." Sarah felt her heart breaking for the little boy Marcus had been, for the loss he had experienced without even understanding what he was losing. She looked at him now, this successful, powerful man who had grown up thinking he was alone in the world, and saw past the expensive suit and careful composure to the child who had lost his sister and never understood why. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I'm sorry you grew up not knowing about me. I'm sorry we lost all those years." Marcus met her eyes and saw his own sense of loss reflected there. "I'm sorry, too," he said. "I'm sorry you grew up in foster care. I'm sorry you didn't have family when you needed it most." Theodore squeezed both of their hands with surprising strength. "We can't change the past," he said firmly, "but we can choose how we move forward from here." Over the following days, Sarah and Marcus began the delicate process of building a relationship from the ground up. They met for coffee, sharing stories about their vastly different childhoods and trying to find the common threads that connected them despite the years and circumstances that had kept them apart. Marcus learned that Sarah had put herself through college working multiple jobs, that she had chosen caregiving as a profession because she understood what it felt like to be alone and vulnerable. She had never married, had never felt like she belonged anywhere long enough to build lasting relationships. Sarah learned that Marcus had thrown himself into work and achievement as a way of filling the emptiness he had always felt, that despite his wealth and success, he had always sensed that something important was missing from his life. He had dated but never seriously committed to anyone, always holding part of himself back without understanding why. They discovered they both loved classical music, both had a tendency to work too hard and sleep too little, both had inherited their mother's artistic sensibilities and their father's stubborn determination. The connections between them ran deeper than shared genetics. There was a fundamental understanding, a recognition that went beyond logic or explanation. Theodore's condition seemed to stabilize during this period, as if having his family back together was providing him with an anchor to the present moment. He still had difficult days, times when the fog would descend, and he would retreat into the confused world of advancing Alzheimer's. But increasingly, he had moments of startling clarity, periods when he could engage meaningfully with both his children and share memories that helped fill in the gaps in their understanding of their family history. Sarah continued working at the memory care facility, but now her shifts there felt different. She wasn't just a caregiver earning a paycheck, she was a granddaughter spending precious time with family. The staff noticed the change in both Theodore and Sarah, the way they lit up when they saw each other, the easy comfort that had developed between them. Marcus began visiting more frequently, sometimes stopping by after work to find Sarah and Theodore engaged in quiet conversation or looking through old photographs together. He started bringing things from the house, more photo albums, some of Margaret's old artwork that had been stored in the attic, a music box that had belonged to his mother. One evening, about 3 weeks after that first revelation, Marcus arrived at the facility to find Sarah sitting alone in Theodore's room. His father was sleeping peacefully in his hospital bed, but something in Sarah's posture suggested that this wasn't an ordinary nap. "How is he?" Marcus asked quietly. Sarah looked up with tears in her eyes. "He's been sleeping most of the day," she said. "The doctor thinks his clarity the past few weeks might have been what they call a final surge. Sometimes people with Alzheimer's have a period of increased awareness before—" She couldn't finish the sentence, but Marcus understood. He sat down in the chair beside her, and together they watched their father's chest rise and fall with each breath. "I'm glad you found us," Marcus said softly. "I'm glad he got to meet you, got to know you were okay." "Me too," Sarah replied, even if it was only for a little while. They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes before Marcus spoke again. "What will you do now?" he asked. "I mean, after—" Sarah considered the question. She had been thinking about it herself, wondering where she belonged in this new reality they had created together. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I never really had a plan beyond just getting by day to day. Having family, having you and grandfather, it changes everything." Marcus reached over and took her hand, the gesture feeling both natural and profound. "You have options now," he said. "You never have to worry about having a place to belong again." Theodore passed away peacefully 2 days later, with both Sarah and Marcus at his bedside. His final words were spoken to Sarah in a moment of perfect clarity. "Tell your mother I never stopped loving her. Tell her I understand why she had to go." The funeral was a small private affair held at the family's long-standing church. Marcus had wanted to honor Theodore's memory without turning his passing into a media spectacle. Only close friends and business associates attended, along with some of the staff from the memory care facility who had grown fond of the old man during his stay there. Sarah stood beside Marcus during the service, feeling the weight of grief and belonging in equal measure. She was mourning a grandfather she had known for only a few weeks, but she was also celebrating the miracle of having found family when she had least expected it. After the service, as they stood in the cemetery watching Theodore's casket being lowered into the ground, Marcus made a decision that would change both of their lives forever. "I want you to help me run the foundation," he said, his voice carrying across the quiet afternoon air. Sarah looked at him in surprise. "What foundation?" "The one we're going to start," Marcus replied, his eyes bright with purpose. "The Margaret Blackwood Foundation. For children who age out of foster care, to help them find their place in the world. To make sure no one else has to grow up feeling as alone as we both did." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes as she considered the profound rightness of this idea, using their family's resources to help other people who had experienced the kind of loss and displacement they had both known. It felt like the perfect way to honor both Theodore's memory and Margaret's legacy. "I don't know anything about running a foundation," she said practically. "You know about taking care of people," Marcus replied. "You know what it feels like to need family and not have it. That's more important than any business degree or nonprofit experience." Over the following months, Sarah and Marcus worked together to establish the Margaret Blackwood Foundation. Marcus handled the legal and financial aspects, using his business expertise to create a sustainable structure for their charitable work. Sarah developed the programs and policies, drawing on her personal experience and professional background to design services that would actually meet the needs of young adults transitioning out of foster care. The foundation provided scholarships for college and vocational training, assistance with housing and job placement, mentoring programs that connected young people with successful adults who could provide guidance and support. But more than just material assistance, the foundation focused on helping young people build the kinds of connections and relationships that could sustain them throughout their lives. Sarah moved into an apartment near Marcus's downtown office so they could work together more easily. She discovered that she had inherited not only her mother's artistic sensibilities, but also her father's head for business and strategic thinking. The foundation grew rapidly under her leadership, expanding from a local program to a regional initiative and then to a national organization. Marcus, meanwhile, found that having Sarah in his life had filled a void he hadn't even realized existed. His business success, while still important to him, no longer felt like the sole measure of his worth. He had family now, real family, and that changed his perspective on everything. They spent holidays together, creating new traditions while honoring the memories of the family members they had lost. Sarah learned to play piano, inspired by the instrument in Theodore's living room and the unfinished sheet music that had belonged to her grandmother. Marcus learned to cook, wanting to create the kind of warm, welcoming home environment that neither of them had experienced as children. On the first anniversary of Theodore's death, they returned to his grave together. Sarah brought flowers, the yellow roses that had been Margaret's favorite, according to Theodore's stories. Marcus brought a printed report about the foundation's first-year accomplishments, including statistics about the young people they had helped and testimonials from program participants. "I think he would be proud," Sarah said, placing the flowers on Theodore's headstone. "I think he would be amazed," Marcus replied. "I think he would have a hard time believing that something so positive could come out of all the pain and loss our family experienced." They stood together in comfortable silence, two people who had found each other against impossible odds and built something meaningful from the pieces of their broken family history. The late afternoon sun slanted through the trees of the cemetery, casting long shadows that reminded them both of that first day in Theodore's room, when an old man's failing memory had somehow held onto the one thing that mattered most: love for his family. As they walked back to Marcus's car, Sarah reflected on the strange path that had brought them to this moment. If Theodore's regular caregiver hadn't called in sick that particular day, if Sarah hadn't been available to fill in, if Theodore's Alzheimer's hadn't granted him that moment of stunning clarity, they might never have found each other at all. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we hadn't met that day?" she asked Marcus as they drove through the tree-lined streets of the neighborhood where he had grown up. "Every day," Marcus replied honestly. "But I've learned that wondering about different possibilities is less important than being grateful for the reality we actually have." Sarah nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. She thought about the 7-year-old girl who had lost her mother and spent years believing she was completely alone in the world. She thought about the successful businessman who had built an empire but had never felt truly connected to another human being. Both of those people had been real. Their pain and loneliness had been real. But they were also part of a larger story that neither of them could have imagined. The Margaret Blackwood Foundation continued to grow and evolve, touching the lives of thousands of young people who might otherwise have fallen through the cracks of an imperfect system. Sarah and Marcus worked together with the easy collaboration of people who understood each other's strengths and compensated for each other's weaknesses. They were more than siblings. They were partners in building something that would outlast both of them. But perhaps more importantly, they had become the family that Theodore and Margaret had always dreamed of having. They had Sunday dinners together, celebrated each other's birthdays, supported each other through difficult times, and shared joy during happy occasions. They had created the kind of close, loving relationship that their parents had hoped for when they first brought Margaret and later Marcus into the world. Years later, when interviewers would ask Sarah about the moment that changed her life, she would always return to that first afternoon in room 237. An elderly man with Alzheimer's disease had looked at her with startling clarity and spoken words that seemed impossible. "I remember you from somewhere." In that moment, neither of them could have predicted where those words would lead. They couldn't have imagined the foundation that would grow from their reunion, the lives that would be changed by their work together, the family that would be rebuilt from the fragments of loss and separation. But Theodore had been right about the most important thing. He did remember Sarah from somewhere, not from his failing memory, but from the deeper place where love lives, where the connections between family members persist even when everything else falls away. His recognition of her that day wasn't just about the past they had missed together. It was about the future they could still build, the healing that could still happen, the love that had never really disappeared but had simply been waiting for the right moment to be rediscovered. Sometimes the most profound changes in our lives come not from dramatic events or carefully planned decisions, but from small moments of recognition, brief instances when we see ourselves reflected in another person and realize we are not alone. Sarah Chen had walked into that memory care facility as a temporary caregiver, filling in for someone else. She left as Sarah Blackwood, a granddaughter, a sister, a keeper of family memories, and a builder of new possibilities for the future. The story of the Blackwood family was far from over. It was just beginning again, written this time by people who understood the value of connection, the power of love to transcend time and circumstance, and the importance of making sure no one else has to face the world alone. Theodore's failing memory had held on to the one thing that mattered most, and in doing so he had given his children the greatest gift possible: each other. In a world where connections seem increasingly rare, where families drift apart and people feel more isolated than ever, the Blackwood story reminds us that sometimes the most important recognition comes from the heart, not the mind. Theodore's Alzheimer's may have stolen his recent memories, but it couldn't erase the love that connected him to his granddaughter across decades of separation. That recognition transcended disease, time, and circumstance to rebuild a family that had been broken by pride and misunderstanding, proving that love truly does find a way. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.